Hello, everyone. Welcome back to I See What You're Saying, the Disciplined Listening Podcast. I'm Michael Reddington, and today it is my pleasure to welcome our next guest, Jeff Weninger. Jeff is committed to reimagining policing here in the United States and abroad. He is a 33-year law enforcement veteran and a retired lieutenant from the LAPD. While with the LAPD, he had many different roles, including being the officer in charge of the Force Investigations Division. He's the author of the book On Thin Ice and is out there every day working, consulting, interviewing, training, educating to help law enforcement continue to reimagine and redefine what they do, improve their service in as many ways as possible. He has all the experience. He has all the education. He's done a ton of research outside of his experience. It's a great conversation. I'm really excited to share all of his ideas with you today. Thank you again for being here for another week. Please, while you're here, take a quick moment to like the show, share the show with your network, certainly subscribe to the show, and please leave us your feedback. We really would love to hear more from you. So today we're going to get into a bunch of different topics, including from his experience, research, and perspective, what is the difference between a warrior mindset and a guardian mindset? And then how does that mindset lead to behaviors down the road? Speaking of the word mindset, we're going to spend a lot of time talking about how do we develop new mindsets and what's the appropriate mindset for different roles in different situations. We're going to get into the topic of rebuilding trust, establishing organizational cultures, the importance of physical fitness and training and education, and so much more. It's a wide-ranging conversation. Really excited to share it with you today. Thank you so much for being with us for another episode. While you're online today, please take a quick moment to check out our sponsors. Head over to humantel.com. That's where you can enter the code INQUASIVE25 for 25% off the best-in-class science-based training for understanding how to identify when emotions change by recognizing shifts in facial expressions and nonverbal communications. I've done it all. I recommend it. It's over at humantel.com. For the professional interviewers, please head over to certifiedinterviewer.com. That's where you can get all your questions answered about both the International Association of Interviewers and the Certified Forensic Interviewer designation. It's all there at certifiedinterviewer.com. And finally, please head over to inquasive.com to learn more about the programs our clients ask us to custom facilitate for their senior leaders, sales teams, HR teams, and more to teach them how to uncover hidden value with strategic and persuasive observation and communication techniques in all of their high-impact conversations. We appreciate you being here for another week. Thank you so much. So without further ado, I introduce to you, Jeff Weninger. Hello, Jeff. It is great to meet you. Thank you for being here today. How are you?
I'm doing just fine. Thank you. Thank you for having me.
It is my pleasure. And as we were talking a little bit offline, it's a conversation I'm really looking forward to because whether it is redefining culture in law enforcement or redefining culture in a business or any organization, many of the same theses are going to apply. So anything we're going to talk about today is certainly going to have a broad base, but in the law enforcement community specifically, it is so important to have conversations like this where we can explore it from a place of outcome and what we're really looking to achieve as opposed to problems or issues or hot points. So really happy to have this conversation today. And as I was getting ready for the conversation and reviewing your book, which I'm sure we're going to talk a lot about in your material, there was one concept that I thought would be a cool place to start the conversation. So I'd like to start by asking you to please walk us through how you see the difference between being a warrior and a guardian.
Well, really, it's about mindset. And mindset is oftentimes driven by the culture. And I've always said that policy and procedure is nothing but words on paper unless the culture is aligned with those policies and procedures. And it's what we have oftentimes in law enforcement is what I call a policy practice gap. Because if there is not an alignment with the culture and the policy and procedures, culture will always win out. So things that can influence culture and the mindset of an officer is a militarization of law enforcement. And the mere fact of how we equip ourselves and the uniforms that we're wearing can impact your mindset. And it was interesting. You asked me this question, but I just read a retired Marine Corps officer's assessment and thoughts on the current state of law enforcement. And I think he was speaking specifically about the way the ICE, the immigration efforts are being carried out relative to what they're wearing. And he's saying, I wore those boots, I wore those uniforms, and I can tell you it impacts your mindset. And it impacts your mindset to where you're more of this warrior mentality rather than a guardian mentality. And it changes your attitudes and your beliefs, which impact your actions and behaviors. And he's talking about we have to be insightful and realize that this is something that's impacting perhaps how our law enforcement, not just at the federal level, but law enforcement, local, state, and federal, actually may carry out their function. So it's something we need to be considering. And the academic background in psychology would also agree with that there is an impact relative to how you perceive yourself and your actual role and function on any given call, in which turns into a rapidly unfolding tactical scenario. So those are things that law enforcement has to take seriously and consider in their deployment of personnel and how we want to equip them and uniform them.
That's a great perspective. And, I like to always make it clear anytime I'm having a conversation with somebody, I've never done their job. I've never worn a badge. So it's been law enforcement adjacent, but, want to make it clear to listeners who might not be familiar that I've never worn a badge. So looking at it from the outside in, when you think about even the impact of somebody's uniform, how many times even in the private sector do we tell people dress for the job you want, not the job you have, or dress for success, or consider your audience. And if I'm coaching somebody who has a speaking engagement, how are you going to present yourself in front? So a football team's uniform has an impact on their mindset when they put it on. So it's a great point to consider. And it is I imagine, and I'd love your thoughts on this, it's a fine line between being a warrior and a guardian, because if you are a guardian, part of that could be taking on the warrior role. And for people who are in that type of situation across a wide spectrum of applications, I imagine that the thought process can be easier to lead with that warrior appearance or warrior mindset, because if it's going to get that far, we may as well be ready, and we may as well let everybody know that we're ready, as opposed to having the training. And we can talk about the power of education, but having the training that leads to a prepared, confident mindset. So we don't necessarily have to put it in everybody's face, but we're still prepared to act if necessary.
Well, that's true. And one of the places that you see this most often is in officer-involved shooting scenarios. Not many people realize that approximately one-third of all officer-involved shootings involve somebody that's suffering a mental health crisis. And why that's so important when we're talking about the guardian versus the warrior mentality is how well do we perceive our presence and how we are deploying ourselves and what we look like to the person that we're trying to obtain compliance from. How are we impacting their behaviors just by our mere presence? Are we insightful to that? And it's really important. I mean, if you think about it, you have multiple officers on scene, probably having multiple officers giving verbal commands. You have people with their guns drawn, a shotgun drawn, a beanbag, less lethal munitions drawn. You have a taser with a red dot on the chest of the individual, and we're trying to obtain compliance. But you and I, we don't have a mental health crisis. And think of how that would impact you and perhaps how you might respond. And you may inadvertently respond in a way that would result in an unfavorable outcome. And the reality is that we have to stand back and have some empathy and compassion, and most importantly, the courage to evaluate the situation and determine what is our actual role here. And is it to impose our authority on somebody? Or is it to engage them to try to attempt to resolve this in the most peaceful manner and obtain compliance voluntarily? And we tend to not do that very well. And I speak to this because when I was with the Los Angeles Police Department as a lieutenant, I was significantly involved in the investigation and adjudication of all lethal force and officer-involved shooting scenarios. So I saw the good, the bad, and the ugly. And I saw how the deployment of police personnel and resources could have an impact on the ultimate outcome. And we oftentimes are making mistakes inadvertently because we're not intuitive and have insight into the impact our mere presence is having on the scenario.
Such a great point, and such a great point in such a I was going to say white hot example. That's probably not the best way to say it, but like a real acute example of how one or a group of individuals' presence can impact the decisions and actions of another. If we think about that in the business context, you've got an executive who runs into a room and is yelling and screaming or slamming doors or standing over somebody or shakes someone's hand and really grips it and won't let them go. And like all of these things that we now blame the other person for their response or lack of response. But in reality, how we approach them and handle the situation is what completed the entire interaction. Now multiply that by maybe 1 million to get to the situations that you're talking about. And I certainly want to acknowledge too that when we're talking about law enforcement officers who day in and day out are putting themselves in harm's way, and they never know when what could be a simple traffic stop or a simple interaction or a simple witness interview just ignites into a kinetic situation. And now, they got to make decisions fast and they all want to go home to their families. So and then there's also the fact that being in those situations in a repeated fashion then conditions people to a new way of operating and observing and thinking. And so I want to just briefly touch on all of that for people who are listening and have been in those situations. I think it's important to recognize that. But I love what you said, not just about the empathy and compassion, but having the confidence to be situationally aware first. Like, wait a minute, what's my role here? And what's the best way to accomplish that role? And I feel like, metaphorically speaking, you can turn the heat up, but it's really hard to turn it back down. So if we redline in an interaction, where do you go from there? But if you bring it up just a couple degrees, you can probably take it back down a couple of degrees. So you mentioned being so closely involved with so many use of force incidents in your role with LAPD. Without getting into the weeds too much, and certainly without exposing details of any specific incident, we don't need to do that. But were there potential checkpoints or warning signs that officers might have been able to recognize to choose another alternative before using force?
Well, there lies the issue. One criticism that people have of law enforcement is that they're not properly trained to recognize and acknowledge what is actually occurring with the person they're trying to obtain compliance from. And that's key because it should change your considerations relative to how best to approach obtaining a most optimal outcome. And wherein law enforcement, unfortunately, over time, has taken on all these roles saying, yes, we can solve that, we can solve that, when in reality, they don't have the training and experience or even, the expertise through inclination to know how best to handle these things. And that's why you've seen this push to align law enforcement officers with mental health practitioners who can better assist and give some guidance and counsel to the law enforcement officers relative to ensuring that the response of the law enforcement officers is not inadvertently escalating the situation. So, a lot of it has to do with the training. And unfortunately, in this country, we have a country that's very unique. We have more guns in this country than we do people in population. So other countries aren't policing in that same environment. But that doesn't mean that we can't learn from those countries. And on my book, On Thin Ice, I went over to London, England, and looked at and studied the Metropolitan London Police, went over to Paris, France, looked at the police agency there. I looked at the Nordic countries on how they train and what their expectations of their officers are, and how that then correlates with how they're perceived by the public. And there's things that can be learned, although those officers aren't policing in an environment where there's this continual threat that things could escalate because of the prevalence of guns that we have in our society. The reality is that we can learn things. I looked at some situations where they confront suspects that are armed with a weapon other than a firearm, like a knife or a hammer or a sword or whatever, and how they handle those incidents and how they see their role. And we here in the United States, we kill about 1,050 people a year through gunfire. And over in the UK and Wales, they had like 5 officer-involved shootings. And they oftentimes have more successful outcomes, even when they're confronting somebody with a weapon that doesn't happen to be a firearm. So I think there's something we can learn from there. Because most importantly, they have lower incidence of officer injuries in the manner in which they handle those types of cases. So we're taking the firearm aspect out of it that many people would argue is the difference between the two. However, we're comparing apples to apples because there is no firearm other than the firearms that the police may have on them that are at the scene. So they're handled very differently and there's different outcomes. So there's something that can be learned relative to that.
I love and I'm fascinated by that approach. And I would agree. And even to step outside of this particular situation, there's so much to learn from adjacent situations. Every single variable doesn't have to be exactly the same. But when we can parse out common denominators, when we look for common threads or what elements are consistent and then start building back from those elements and then looking how to adapt them to our unique application, there's all kinds of opportunities to learn. And it's true in business, it's true in law enforcement, it's true in military, it's true everywhere, it's true in science. So I'm curious, as you were looking at some of these international law enforcement departments, what were some of the big lessons or takeaways that you learned that we might be able to apply in some shape or form here in the States?
It's culture and mindset and actually how they're trained. Our training here in the United States tends to be hyper vigilant and focus on using force in order to obtain compliance, where they see things much differently there. You look at in London, the average patrol officer doesn't even have a firearm. So they have to approach things much differently. And I've often said there's a reason why we have tactical best practices. It's because though it's those tactical practices that are going to give the officer the best likelihood that this incident could be resolved peacefully without an escalation of force, and it protects the officer. My personal definition of tactics is taking all the steps necessary to ensure that somebody that is intent on harming an officer, you're taking away all that opportunity. But oftentimes in this day and age, we see it all the time with body-worn video. Vast majority of officers are wearing body-worn video, and they're leaving positions of cover. They're closing the distance, all those sorts of things, trying to impose their authority, the fact that they're wearing a uniform and a badge, saying, you have to listen to me, that I'm giving you a legal request. I have the legal authority to ask you to do this, and you better do it. And if you don't, then they escalate with force. And that's not what we necessarily see in regards to how the same type of a scenario is handled in these other countries, because the mindset is very different.
Great point. And in fairness, there are going to be times where that type of command and control response is required. So I don't want to, for many of my comments, I don't want to give the impression that I think it's 100% wrong. There's a time and place and situational awareness for everything when that type of behavior and reaction is 100% warranted. But generally, and you've already mentioned this, how we approach somebody dictates their response. So just go home today and yell. Like if I was to go, I have a young son. If I was to go home today and just yell at my son, thank you for doing a good job, because I yelled, thank you for doing a good job, he's going to get scared just because I yelled it, even though I'm thanking him for something. So how we approach somebody verbally, the pace, where we're standing, even the angle, like I'm not going to nerd out, but all of these things are so very important to how we can de-escalate a situation. And to your point, if it was possible to start focusing on de-escalation, or if it was easier to focus on safe resolution as opposed to control the situation, because control is often misaligned with dominate, and dominate is going to create counter dominant actions, either intentionally or out of confusion. And now here we go, it escalates. So when we look at and I want to be careful with how I say this, with the socio-political world around law enforcement today, I think it's fair to say that not in every community, not with every department, and not with every officer, but there are trust concerns between citizens and law enforcement. And we could probably spend 4 hours talking about the line between valid and invalid and political and whatever else. But if we just accept the fact that to some degree there are trust issues, as can be with any organization, with any group of people, from your perception, what are some of the best ways that we can start rebuilding that trust?
Well, first, I'd like to just start and reinforce and highlight what you just said. Trust me, the vast majority of police officers are great people, and they have absolutely no intention of causing harm to people if things can be resolved peacefully. That is the reality. It's really all about mindset, though, and police officers should not be pacifists. There are times when police officers have to use force. Law enforcement is never going to be pretty at times. And there's going to be times when they're going to be warranted and it's going to be necessary for them to use lethal force. And things are going to end tragically. And that's not the fault of the officers. That is a reality that everybody has to understand that. But that does not mean that we can't be honest with ourselves and critical of ourselves and look at these scenarios, because I have yet to see any tactical scenario where I couldn't identify something that can be improved upon. I did 33 years in the LAPD. I worked the streets. I worked down in South Central, some of the most violent neighborhoods. I ran the Rampart gang unit. We're addressing some of the most violent gang members anywhere in this country. And I understand that whole entire dynamic. But at the end of the day, I think it's really important that we underscore, and I want to emphasize what you had just said. So, in regards to the question, if you could go ahead and repeat that, because I kind of went off on a tangent, but
And I probably took too long to ask it anyway. So, but I'm glad you did go off on that tangent because it's important to reinforce rebuilding trust. What are some of the steps that you believe would be most impactful as we look at rebuilding trust?
well, really, but we have to look at the reality is only about 20% of people 16 years of age or older have direct contact with the police. So about 80% of our population is forming their opinions based on what they see on TV or what they hear other people talking about. So the area in which law enforcement really needs to focus on is managing the media and the message. And unfortunately, law enforcement doesn't do a real good job of that. I mean, we can just look at these significant incidents that were noteworthy over the past year. I mean, going back to January 1 in New Orleans of last year, I mean, what a debacle in those press conferences. There was nothing that was going to give anybody confidence that law enforcement handling this situation was going to be handling the investigation in a way that was going to be giving people the answers that they rightfully needed to know. So, we see that. We saw with the Charlie Kirk assassination, where they're reporting that they had the suspects in custody, and with my background overseeing over 700 lethal force cases, I know that there's no way you can be saying those things that early on in the investigation. And the reality is that you have to pause and let the investigation take its time to evolve, because it's a process. It's a process that requires that you be patient. And the law enforcement can't cower or come forward with information because of the pressure that they're getting from society, who wants to have information at their fingertips at a moment's notice. And so it's really important that you control that message. And it's required that law enforcement executives get some counsel from people that are experts in the media, and incorporating those people into the organization so they can give the best guidance relative to what information should we release, what information should we hold back and keep close to our chest, what impact will that have on the community and the community's trust of the organization relative to how we're proceeding with this investigation. And those are all things that need to be considered. And we see all too frequently that the messaging is just not good, and it erodes that trust.
Which is unfortunately easier when there are already people out there trying to help that trust erode itself. So it ends up fitting, instead of into the narrative the department needs, it ends up accidentally fitting into another narrative that is counterproductive, because whether we like it or not, there's people in relation to lots of issues creating pro and anti narratives. And this is just one example where we could be referencing that. A lesson that I have to give my dad for credit for teaching me. I don't have to. Let me rephrase that, Dad. Sorry. I gladly give my father credit for teaching me young is, let the situation come to you. And when you think about an investigation, it is going to unfold. There is going to be a lot of times, and just as well as anybody, you think you got great evidence, then you turn over one more rock that just eliminates all the evidence you had before. Turns out it was wrong. It doesn't count. It was misguided. Here's something new, something more important. It's a dynamic environment that's consistently changing. And even to step away from investigations just a second, the same holds true in businesses. When senior leadership is pressed to make a statement on something or to give information on something, well, hang on, maybe we can give an interim statement to give people an update on the steps that we're taking and when we anticipate being able to share more information so they don't think we're ignoring them. But sharing information that is half-baked, that's brand new, that hasn't been vetted, that could impact the clarity and accuracy of the information we get next. To bring up a point you brought up before, that could create an unintentional, unhealthy reaction that generates a subset of problems we wouldn't have needed to solve if we didn't say the things that we did. So when you've got people who are tactically very proficient, hopefully, the skill set that they have been brought up with isn't necessarily that media savvy strategic communication. So you're asking people with one skill set to be proficient at another, which circles back to the whole education piece and situational awareness piece that you've been mentioning. You brought up use of force several times as obviously a big part of what you've done and a very serious issue, not trying to downplay it at all. And I feel like, and correct me on this, please, you will never hurt my feelings. There's a bit of a common thread between use of force and feeling pressure to get in front of a microphone and talk in a bunch of people and answer questions live. And that is the rising levels of stress. And as those stress levels rise and our brain shuts down and fear picks up and we're unsure, and hopefully we go to what we know and that's a good thing, or we start making mistakes. As you think back, particularly to your research and experience with use of force situations, were you able to determine or reinforce any specific techniques to help people think, breathe, problem solve as their stress levels are rising?
Well, that's a great question in regards to the stress. And this is one huge gap that needs to be filled with law enforcement. You go to the academy, you have all of these criteria and standards that you have to meet: physical fitness standards, your ability to perform certain defensive tactics, maneuvers, and things of that nature. You have to fire a qualification and perform at a minimum proficiency and all those sorts of things. And the vast majority of law enforcement agencies, after you graduate, there are no standards beyond that. And we have to understand, and I talk about this in my book at great lengths, the importance of your physical health, because the biology of being a human impacts how you can perform under stress. Your heart rate's going to go up. Your ability to perceive the environment that you're going to have to be making judgments about will be impacted by your conditioning. The worse condition you're in, the harder you're going to have the time of being able to perceive what's going on to make good decisions. And that's a reality. It's unfortunate. We see law enforcement, there's no standard whatsoever after you graduate for maintaining a certain level of physical fitness. Nor do you get much in training. In California, you have the police officer standards and training. And yes, when you graduate the academy, you have to show proficiency in grappling and all these various moves. Well, yes, that's considered a perishable skill, but about every few years, you get a 4-hour block of instruction. And if that's all you're doing, guess what? You're not going to be very confident in your abilities to handle yourself with those techniques. And then you're going to be more likely to go to an escalation, your gun. And it's being done because of your lack of confidence in your ability to handle things, either with pugilistic, striking people, or the reality is that about 85% of physical altercations within the first 30 seconds goes to the ground. So you better be good at Brazilian jiu-jitsu or your grappling techniques, those sorts of things that you train in. But the vast majority of police officers, they're not training in that. So what are we doing? We're putting our officers out there, and when they fail, is it really their fault? Is the organization that they work for equipping them to be successful? And I would suggest all too often, no, they're not.
No, and we can blame whether it's bureaucratic red tape and funding availability and scheduling availability. And I'm going to make this number up. I have no scientific basis for what I'm about to say at all. But let's say that the average police officer in the United States, we're not talking about specialized units, just average officer needs 10 hours of training a week to stay proficient with interviewing skills, with physical fitness, with grappling self-defense skills, with firearms training, with driving skills, with all of these things, right? And there's probably a dozen more we could list. Well, how do you take an officer off the street for 10 hours a week? We need the coverage. That's why he's there. So there's things that are above my pay grade, but you're 100% right in the assessment that having the education and having the consistency and having the familiarity. And I want to go back to the physical health thing too. And I've got to give lots of credit to my friend Aaron and other people who really have enforced or instilled that in me. And I say this as a self-critique. You mentioned self-critique before. We're probably going back 15 or 16 years ago now. But I was not in a period of time where I was taking care of myself. I was traveling a lot. I was eating terrible. I wasn't exercising. If I was on the road, I was really eating terribly. But if I was at home, I was being lazy because I knew I'd have to go back out on the road. So I did an interrogation that was maybe 15 minutes from my house. And for what my former teammates and I used to do was par for the course. There was nothing especially different or stressful about it at all, outside of the norm that we already experienced. And my heart was pounding throughout that whole interrogation. And I remember at times thinking I was out of breath and I was trying to calm myself down. And I'm trying to figure out why. Like there was no abnormal escalation. There were no physical threats. There was no extra denial. Like there was nothing that you could point out and say, this is where I'm getting jacked up. And then in reflection, unfortunately, longer down the road after that, I was in terrible physical condition. So I put myself in a conversation where I was going to have to think fast on my feet. I was going to have to be fully engaged. I was going to have to juggle multiple things at multiple times. And that just put enough, that extracted enough of a toll on my body that I couldn't keep, well, I struggled to keep up because I wasn't in good physical condition. So that's just one example in a non-physical environment that I can vouch for, but it's so, so, so important. You've talked about mindset several times, mindset for staying healthy, mindset for staying educated, mindset for interactions out in the community. From your perspective, with all of your research and experience, what are the optimal mindset or mindsets that officers should be developing?
Well, really, it's about blending your life and having life-work balance. It couldn't be more important than in this career in law enforcement, because if you tend to gravitate to this insular culture within law enforcement, you're going to become exposed to the groupthink, and you're not going to have challenges to your way of thought and your perspective, and you're just going to be reinforcing things that perhaps may be negative. And I've always said it's the importance of having friendships and relationships with people outside of law enforcement is very, very important. A relationship that you have with a higher power, that's a personal basis, but something relative to that is very important to incorporate into your life. Family first, always taking care of your family, and that means taking care of yourself. And making your family aware of some of the things and the struggles that you may have, that you can't go through a career where you're going to be seeing some of the things that you're going to see that are inherent to law enforcement, without people understanding at times the things that you're being exposed to that may impact you, perhaps your mood, your ability to sleep, and those sorts of things. And oftentimes in law enforcement, we result to, alcohol and those sorts of things to try to mask some of the things that we may be feeling. And all of those are practices that are just always going to um, escalate and cause you to go down this deep hole in a spiral. And there is a reality that 20 times more police officers kill themselves than people in the general population. And there's a whole cultural aspect to that where we have to question law enforcement agencies if in fact they have the resources available, which many don't. does the culture allow that to occur? Or is there a stigma placed on those officers that say, hey, I'm having a problem? And it doesn't always have to be, a hellacious shootout where you nearly lose your life that can impact you and cause you to struggle with stuff. There's a lot of sad things that you're dealing with. You're dealing with people that are having the worst incidents in their life, and you're there to help resolve things and to try to help people proceed forward and engage in the law enforcement action relative to that. And it can be very, very impactful on your life and your ability to be mentally well yourself. So you have to have insight within yourself to know that you're struggling and to ask for that help. That's really, really important. And there's been a lot of strides made for that. But there's still so much room for improvement. I can tell you with the LAPD, when you're involved in an officer-involved shooting, you used to just be involved in an officer-involved shooting, and you'd be interviewed by the investigative entity, and you just carry on. And the next day, you're out there doing police work. Well, now you have multiple appointments with the behavioral science services, and they want to make sure, and they have to sign off on that you're ready to go back out there and potentially face another critical situation, and that you're in a healthy mindset to be able to do so. And that's good. That's important. And it's done in a confidential way where officers feel that if they are having an issue, they can say, I need a little bit of time. And it's not just the officer, it's the family too. If, you have a spouse or a significant other, you have a primary trauma at work, and you make the decision in your life to share that with them, you're potentially creating a secondary trauma for them. So we can't just look so narrowly at the officer themselves. You have to look at their support group outside of the law enforcement agency and how they may also need some help relative to understanding and processing what their loved one is going through as a result of being a law enforcement officer.
Again, all so important points. And yes, thankfully, strides have been made. Lots to go. But thankfully, it's becoming more of a point of focus and more, as awful as it is to say, socially acceptable. And within that, I think you also made two very critical points. One about the family at home, potentially the secondary trauma by informing them. Your husband or wife who loves you at home knows that you had this near tragic event today. Well, you got to go back out tomorrow. So how are they going to feel? How's that going to make you feel and impact your ability? But sometimes it's even when we don't inform people of the things that are stressing us out in our lives, but it changes how we interact with them, how we relate with them, which then starts creating and snowballing trauma and other problems at home, and that cycle never ends. So what impacts us at work, whatever our job may be, impacts us at home. What's going on at home impacts us at work. And then here we start spinning, and that can start spinning out of control.
It's in law enforcement, we want to talk about all the escalation and increased attacks on law enforcement officers. And, we lose about 60 law enforcement officers nationwide a year. And we lose about 200 to suicide. So, I mean, that's kind of putting into context the need to focus on that in the mental health of law enforcement officers. And that's only 200 that are active. You see a lot of people have problems after they leave the job, because when you're on the job, you tend to have this armor of protection. And when you leave, I call it unpacking the shelf. You can't really move on with your life until you unpack that shelf, because what happens during your career is you have all these various incidents that are impacting you, package it all up and you put it on the shelf. And that's how you protect yourself. That's part of your armor. But that shelf is full when you retire, and it has to be processed and dealt with before you're able to really move on. And at that time, you could oftentimes find people that have problems and ultimately make that horrible decision to take their own lives. And that's not even part of that 200 that I'm talking about. So, it's very critical. And I have friends that I worked with, and were my peers and colleagues throughout my career that I speak to on a regular basis because they struggle, and they have PTSD and things. And like I said, it doesn't require you to be in some hellacious shootout. It's we are programmed as law enforcement officers to be problem solvers and to fix things. And when you run into these scenarios where there's nothing you can do to make it better or stop the pain for these citizens, um, it takes a toll on you, and you have to deal with it at some point, but during your career or afterwards. And if you're not dealing with it, it's going to manifest itself in other ways. You're going to be using alcohol or whatever to mask the feelings and emotions that you have.
That's true for anybody, but especially true for people who have been in law enforcement scenarios. It's just even the ones that I've seen indirectly. It gives me a small appreciation for what officers can experience, unfortunately, on a daily or nightly basis. You talked about conversations that you have with your friends and your colleagues and people who suffer. By no means do I want any details or specifics, but just in general, from having those conversations, what have you learned that we can share with others to make it easier for other people to take maybe the first step to open up and seek that help and get to a better place?
Well, it's really recognizing what's going on with you and identifying that as a problem, whether it's having trouble at times just getting out of bed, you're moody, um, you're having problems sleeping, your relationships start to suffer because of how you're managing yourself in a non-productive way. You start feeling distant from those people that are really there to be a support for you. All of those things should be red flags going off where you're like, I need to look for somebody for guidance, for some help, and hopefully law enforcement agencies are similar to the LAPD where you have peer counselors. I served as a peer counselor where you can talk to somebody that is on the job and can relate to some of the things that you're going through, but it's done very confidentially. The department will never know what you're disclosing to the peer counselor. And there's programs like that for law enforcement officers. But the reality is about 70% of law enforcement agencies patrol populations about 10,000 or less. And there's really not necessarily the resources that we had the luxury of the LAPD having. That therein lies the challenge. And hopefully the states who are the ones that certify police officers to be police officers in their state recognize the severity of all these things and make it possible for these resources to be available to officers that perhaps work in these smaller agencies that don't have them readily available to them. It's crucial because whether we're talking about mental health, whether we're talking about competency on the job in performing your tasks, especially under rapidly unfolding tactical scenarios where you're making split-second decisions, are we doing the best things, the things that we need to be doing to maximize our officers' ability to perform their jobs and perform their jobs safely? That's what my book is all about. It's about reimagining policing. I did 33 years in law enforcement out in Los Angeles. In my entire career, I spent thinking about how can we do things better? And that's really what my book's all about. But it requires that we have some very difficult conversations. And it begins with, how we train. If we look at American law enforcement, there's no national standard for the police academy duration of time. The average is about 800 hours. So let's put that into context. To apply for your cosmetology license, you need about 1,500 hours of training, nearly twice what a police officer needs to go out there and perhaps be making the most critical decision they'll ever make, where they're going to be utilizing lethal force to stop somebody from doing something who's posing a threat of serious bodily injury or death to the officer or to somebody else. I mean, these are critical things. And only about 60% of law enforcement agencies require their officers to fire at the range only 1 to 2 times a year. Only 1% of agencies nationwide require it monthly. It's if you don't see the problem with this, 42% of law enforcement officers, they don't get any de-escalation training. And we wonder why as a society, because I would suggest that societal expectations of law enforcement have evolved more quickly than law enforcement agencies themselves. And that's why we have this huge gap. But the expectations of the outcomes that society has for law enforcement have evolved much more rapidly than actually law enforcement itself. And I bleed blue. I want law enforcement to be successful moving forward in the 21st century, but I want them to reimagine policing on their own and navigate that successful path forward on their own rather than have it imposed on them. While I was with the LAPD in the late 90s, we had the DOJ, Department of Justice, investigating us. And we had a consent decree imposed on us. And it took us nearly 10 years to get out from under that. And that's what I want all law enforcement agencies to avoid. Navigate it yourself and acknowledge the mistakes that other agencies have made and learn from them, and don't require your agency to make that same mistake before you take furtive action to make a decision to learn from that mistake and change your policies and procedures and implement better practices or the best practices so your organization can avoid those mistakes made by other agencies. And unfortunately, we tend not to do that very well in law enforcement. We're kind of insular. We look at what's going on in our organization and don't really care about what's going on elsewhere.
A ton of great points there. And that's great advice, really, for any human being. Find people in similar situations. Don't just look at what they do well, but look at the mistakes they've made, whether they realize that they're mistakes or not. Learn from their mistakes. And then, obviously, in law enforcement, I want to be careful with how I say this, but go make your own. Go make different ones that you can learn from and you can grow from and others can grow from, instead of just retreading the examples that we already have for us. And that goes even outside of law enforcement. You made another point there that I wanted to get back to, and I talked myself right away from it. So I'll do this one instead and see if I can miraculously come up with the question I forgot to ask. When you talked about, and this actually goes back to something you said in the beginning, when if policy doesn't align with culture, culture dictates the behavior and actions, policy doesn't. So as we're talking about learning from other agencies and some of the things, again, that you learned overseas, and particularly learning from mistakes that they're out there for many people to access, but you particularly would have had access to. What do you believe are some of the biggest cultural shifts that can be made to have, I don't want to say immediate impact, right? Because everything takes time, but to really get the ball moving in the right direction, what type of cultural shifts do you recommend first?
Well, really, it begins with listen carefully. And what I mean by that is you listen carefully, not to form a response to what they're saying, but listen with the intention of understanding. And you question carefully. So if you're listening and you truly want to understand, you're going to have questions. So you have clarity and you question carefully. And then from a law enforcement perspective, you can speak deliberately. But vast majority of people, they just want to feel as if they're heard and respected. And we need to ensure that we're doing that. It's important that we incorporate people at the table that have conflicting opinions and be willing to hear perspectives that are contrary to our own in order to navigate that path forward. It's my experience during my 33 years that law enforcement never has it figured out properly. You have to consider the outside perspective. And during my career, Chief William Bratton, who came to the LAPD from the NYPD, where he was a police commissioner, watching his leadership style, where he incorporated people from outside the law enforcement organization to very high profile and positions that had significant authority and had a seat at the table when decisions were being made was quite impactful to me. And I'll give you an example. So
Please.
we were under the consent decree when he was our chief of police, and he brought in Jerry Chaliff, never had been a police officer. He was an attorney, and made him the commanding officer of the consent decree bureau. That's a deputy chief level position, and he had a seat at the table. When I was briefing the chief on the officer-involved shooting cases and writing the chief's rationale that submitted to the Honorable Board of Police Commissioners relative to the adjudication of those cases, Jerry Chaliff was sitting right there. And he welcomed his counsel that may be different than what you would hear from within the organization. He was doing his due diligence to ensure that he had all the information and was considering everything he needed to be considering in making his decisions on how to best move forward with these critical incidents. Another example was with media relations. Traditionally, you would have somebody that went through the police academy, came through the ranks, and was a level of a captain, and put them in charge as the commanding officer of media relations. Well, Bratton saw the importance of media relations, and he brought in Mary Grady. And she had been a journalist in Los Angeles for decades and was an Emmy Award-winning journalist, and put her in charge as a civilian of media relations. So she was providing him counsel on the importance of releasing this information or not releasing this information. What impact would that have on the communities, and how would that impact the trust that communities had of the police department? And granted, she wasn't making the decisions, but William Bratton was getting all of the information so he could make the most informed decision. And he was masterful at it. And that's what that experience of watching that was very impactful on what I feel is important moving forward for law enforcement to be successful in the 21st century.
I love what you said there at the end. Make the most informed decision. What do we need to do to put us in place to make the most informed decision? And how many times have we heard people say, if you think you're the smartest person in the room, then you're probably in the wrong room. Like, surround yourself with people who are smarter than you, different expertise, outside opinions. And that's, I mean, under very unique circumstances, considering, I mean, I was a young adult in the mid to late 90s. So I remember some of the things, even though I grew up on the East Coast, that the LAPD was dealing with at that time, because it was national news. So that was a unique point in time in history for the LAPD. But to come in from New York, opposite side of the country, and then bring in people from outside of the law enforcement community, I mean, that I can only imagine how most of I want to share that I'm clearly saying this with respect, but many to most of the officers must have been like, who are these people and what are they going to come in and tell us what to do? I mean, for me, someone who's been law enforcement adjacent, when I walk into a police department, people are looking at me like, who the hell are you and what are you doing here? Which I get, right? I don't have a problem with that. There's trust that has to be earned. So, but to take those steps and to be solution focused and to understand the outcomes you're trying to achieve and assemble the team that's likely to get you there, and then put the right people in position and give them the power and authority to let their expertise do the work. That speaks a ton to him for doing it. It speaks so much to you for recognizing it and then also following that example as well.
Yeah, I mean, it was instrumental in how I saw law enforcement and how I believe law enforcement can be successful moving forward by having a different type of staffing model within the organization. It's not enough. We heard this term, community policing, where you reach out and want to see what the community thinks. But it's really important that the community be part of the organization and actually woven in. And I don't mean that as a clerk typist or as a PSR, somebody answering the 911 calls and those sorts of things. I mean, people having a seat at the table who have authority and influence within the organization to ensure that the best decisions are being made. There's no other way to do it. There really isn't. But unfortunately, law enforcement has been so insular, and they don't want to look outside themselves in order to get some counsel on how best to handle things. And that's why we continue to see the same failures over and over and over again. I look at, I have an elite athletic background where I played ice hockey. I played Division I collegiate ice hockey. I played United States Hockey League and would have had a fairly formidable professional career if not for some major injuries. But I apply those experiences in my athletic background to my professional law enforcement career, wherein you have to have diversified backgrounds and experiences. It's like, Patrick Mahomes is probably one of the best quarterbacks of all time, certainly going to be a Hall of Famer. But if the Chiefs were nothing but a bunch of Patrick Mahomes, they wouldn't win a ball game. Mm-hmm. So you have to have the insight to say, we need all of these diverse experiences and levels of expertise. And quite frankly, coming through the academy and going through the police training and the experience of working on the job is not necessarily going to provide the person that can give you that level of expertise that you actually need. I mean, another thing that Bratton did is he appointed Luann Pinnell, who is a psychologist, as the one in charge of the academy training as well as in-service training of police officers, a civilian. I mean, it was masterful. And, you don't see that now. I mean, this was back 20 years ago. But there's something to be learned, and it's something that's probably be emulated and modeled today. for the ultimate result and the better outcomes for law enforcement organizations moving forward.
That's a great case study for sure. And once again, as we wrap up, I want to be very respectful of your time. To be respectful and acknowledgement of law enforcement, if you're part of a group of people that feels misunderstood, attacked, alienated, any of those things, then you fall in on yourself. And that's true for any group. That could be a sports team in a locker room, that could be a law enforcement group, that could be a community group. That's just how psychology works. But to then be able to, as the examples you're giving, which make a fantastic case study, to be able to look beyond that and say, hey, how do we reach out and how do we bridge these gaps and rebuild trust and reimagine what we do? All great points. You've got so much good stuff going on. You've got your book that's out. You have your speaking engagements, your consulting work that you do. You also have a really cool scholarship. So for people who are listening to this, they're appreciating your perspective and enjoying learning from you. Take all the time you need. Please walk us through how can people stay connected with you, continue to learn from you, and of course, I want to ask, benefit from the scholarship that you have set up.
Right. Well, I have a book. It's called On Thin Ice, an LAPD veteran's journey to reimagine policing. And I think words matter. And there's no mistake on why I use the term reimagine policing. I really don't care for police reform. I don't care for defund police because that's attacking law enforcement, saying you're doing something wrong. Law enforcement is not doing something wrong. Law enforcement just has an opportunity to do things better. And reimagine policing gives them, it empowers law enforcement to navigate that path forward for themselves. So that's why I focus on the term reimagine policing. It's to empower law enforcement to be successful rather than have things imposed on them. So I believe it's very important that law enforcement focus and put an emphasis on education. All of the empirical evidence of research demonstrates that law enforcement officers that have a 4-year degree or better tend to be better law enforcement officers. There's 40% less incidents of force, 40% less incidents of personnel complaints. They're less likely to violate policy and procedure. They're critical thinkers. They're able to assert better judgment. And the reality is that they have a better understanding of the complex issues that are facing law enforcement. So it's really important. And that's where I put my money where my mouth is. I have a reimagining policing scholarship wherein you read the book and you take principles from that book and you talk about first and foremost how do we improve the accountability of law enforcement, how do we grow the trust between law enforcement and the communities we serve, and how do we better take care of the officers and the wellness of those officers who serve and protect our communities on a daily basis. And you write an essay, 1,000 to 1,500 words, and you submit that. And it's a $30,000 scholarship. I have it set up where it's undergraduate as well as graduate and law school. They're not competing against each other. So each one, first prize would be 7,000, second prize is 5,000, third prize is 3,000. Combined, it's a total of $30,000. So, like I said, I'm putting my money where my mouth is because I just finished speaking. I had four speaking engagements where I have as a guest lecturer at Clemson University and spoke to the criminal justice students there. And let me tell you, what a rewarding experience. I think this generation gets a bad rap. Wow, what insightful, knowledgeable, enthusiastic young hearts and minds that are going to influence the law enforcement future of this country. And I couldn't think of a better way to try to help and influence law enforcement to be successful moving forward than to reach out and engage with these young students and as well as try to assist them through, in a small way, a scholarship.
Well, that's fantastic. You call it putting your money where your mouth is, but you're really standing up and taking an active role in making a difference and seeking the change that you stand for. So certainly, congratulations for that. A lot of people have opinions and have a lot to say, but you're standing behind it and taking action. And it also has not been lost on me that you're a former D1 hockey player and you named your book On Thin Ice. I just want to Now I kind of have an idea where the title of your book might have came from as well. Where can people find you online? Where can people follow you?
Well, if you want to get the book, you can find it on Amazon, Barnes and Noble, or anywhere where they sell books. You can find it. If you're more interested in what I'm doing and want to read other articles that I publish, you can find me at Jeff Weninger on LinkedIn or on Facebook. But it's just really encouraging. My book has been routinely in the top 5 on the Amazon bestseller list for law enforcement books. I was just recently told and was confirmed that my book has been incorporated into a undergraduate study program at the College of the Canyons in Santa Clarita, California, where it's the ethical foundations in modern policing, the Peelian principles, and my book has been incorporated into that undergraduate program. So I'm encouraged because it seems to suggest that society is ready to have some of these difficult conversations that I think are necessary. And we are going to, hopefully be having a positive impact on law enforcement where everybody, whether you're in law enforcement or you're the citizens that are being served, are going to be winning. And things will get better for everybody. Everybody should feel empowered and hopeful for the future.
That's great news. I'm glad to hear that it is being incorporated and that it is having that impact, because certainly the message is so very important. Thank you for all of your service. Thank you for all that you're continuing to do. I really appreciate you taking the time to sit down with us today. Thank you for all that you've shared. I look forward to staying in touch. Please keep fighting the great fight and stay in touch. Stay safe out there.
All right. Thank you. It was a pleasure.
Thank you. Jeff, thank you for a great conversation. The depth of your experience, the depth of your research, and the clarity of your commitment to reimagining law enforcement is very, very apparent. And I really appreciate everything you shared with us today, all the work you did in your career, and all the work you continue to do. Thank you. You made so many great points. I have to mention how you talked about how important it is to listen and question carefully. A great point, and one that we should all go back and take the time to reflect on. I also like how you talked about making the most informed decision. That's an admirable thing in so many contexts, in so many situations, within the constraints that we deal with. How do we set aside the goal to make the most informed decision as often as possible? And then to go all the way back to the beginning of the conversation, you talked about how attitudes and beliefs impact actions and behaviors. So important to think about that. If we can create the culture that drives the mindset, that shapes the attitudes and beliefs, now we can start impacting the actions and behaviors on the back end. Thank you for a great conversation. I really appreciate all the time you shared with us today. And of course, thanks to all of you for being here for another great episode. We appreciate you being here week after week to learn from everybody that we bring on. Hopefully you were taking notes right alongside me throughout that whole conversation. While you're online, please, again, if you take just a moment, like the show, subscribe to it, share it with your network, leave us your feedback. We really would love to hear from you. Of course, take the moment to follow Jeff online as well. And please take a quick moment to check out our sponsors. You can head over to humantel.com, enter the code 25% off for the best-in-class science-based online training to learn how to recognize when people's emotions are shifting by identifying changes in their facial expressions and nonverbal communication. I've done it all myself. I highly recommend it. It's all over at humantel.com. For the professional interviewers, please head over to certifiedinterviewer.com. That's where you can get all your questions answered, everything you need to know about both the Certified Forensic Interviewer designation and the International Association of Interviewers. It's all there, certifiedinterviewer.com. Check it out. And finally, while you're online today, please check out inquasive.com to learn more about the programs our clients ask us to custom facilitate for their senior leaders, sales teams, HR teams, and more to teach them how to create the relationships necessary to provoke productive responses, to solve the problems that they need to solve in all of their high-impact conversations. We appreciate you being here for another week. Thank you so very much. Please stay safe, take care of each other, and we'll see you next time.